Hi, I'm Dr. George with Jumpstart Jazz Guitar, helping you make better music. Before we start, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our videos. Have you ever wondered what sets great jazz musicians apart from the rest of us? In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 key habits that are common to most successful jazz musicians. Now, the first habit is listening, and it's listening all the time, actively, and more deeply than most people. I was once at a clinic with Ernie Watts, the great jazz saxophonist, and one of the participants asked him what music he listened to. And without dropping a beat, Ernie said, all of it. And he's right. We hear all the music all the time. Sometimes I go into a mall and I have to leave because the music is so obnoxious. And there's other times I'm being out to dinner with some friends and I'll comment on the background music and they'll look at me like I'm nuts. They didn't even notice it was there. But it goes beyond that too. It's also what we hear. And so musicians, listen more deeply. Now, I used to do an exercise with my college students. The first thing that we'd do is we'd listen to a piece of music and then I'd ask them what they heard. And you'd really be surprised. I mean, these are music majors, but you'd be surprised at just how little they actually heard. The average person often hears the lyrics and pretty much is oblivious to everything else. So when we listen to everything. When you listen to a piece of music, you should be trying to hear something new every time you hear it. And if it doesn't have that kind of layering, that kind of depth, maybe you need to be listening to something a little bit more interesting. It also has even more to do when we're playing with others. I often play with players who are really quite technically accomplished. They can play very well, but it's pretty clear that they're not really listening to others. They're kind of in their own world. And when I hear that, one of the tricks that I do is that the first thing it's my turn to solo, I bring it way down. And, you can tell immediately whether or not they're paying attention. When we're playing with others, when we're comping and accompanying others, like Victor Wooten told us, our goal is to make people sound good, somebody else sound good, not to make us sound good. Okay? Now, there's one other thing that you should do with listening, and that's listening to yourself. But you don't want to be doing that while you're playing. You want to actually be able to do that later. So a good idea is to record yourself at least once a week, and then stop and take a listen to it and find out what you're doing right and what you need to do a little bit better. Now, another thing that pros do really well is they practice efficiently and they practice consistently. Now, most of them will try to practice every day and they really regret it if they don't, but they don't have unlimited time. Okay. If you're playing gigs, if you're playing, 3 or 4 nights a week or even, more, you don't really have time to practice 2, 3, 4 hours a day anymore. And so you have to be more efficient. Now, an easy way to do that is to follow something like the 80-20 rule. And what that means is that you're going to spend 80% of your time on 20% of the music, but it's going to produce 80% of the results. And so what we're talking about here is that in any song, you're going to find that 80% of it's pretty easy and maybe 20% of it is going to give you some challenges. That's where you spend almost all of your time practicing. Now, when I was doing auditions with our college students, occasionally they'd come in and we'd have somebody that prepared a difficult piece. And they'd play along and there's, easy parts and they'd get to one of the hard parts and they'd flub it. So they'd back up and they'd try to get through it again and they'd probably flub it again. And then eventually they'd just kind of muddle their way through it and then finish the piece to the end. And it was clear that's what they had practiced, that they always were practicing it from the beginning to the end. And when they got to that one spot, that's what happened. They kind of flubbed it. Had they spent all of their time working on that, they would have been able to go through the piece easily. Now, another thing that pros do is that they practice things until they can't get it wrong. Most amateurs will practice something, and if you get it right once, we got it. Not a pro. A pro is going to make sure that they can't get it wrong. So one habit of mine is to practice it until I can play it 5 times in a row without any hesitation. Okay? When you're making mistakes, it's usually because you're not quite sure where your fingers are going to go. And you can feel it. You know when you've tried to play a note, tried to play something, and you got through it, and yeah, you made it, but your fingers didn't quite know where to go. And so you got to practice a little more until you get it so that you don't have to fight that. You can do this. Okay, it's going to take maybe a little longer. If you're not practicing 2 or 3 hours a day, well, of course, that will take some time. But that's okay, because pros are practicing for the next gig, next week. You have a longer time frame. And so you can take your time and make sure that you start to get things right so that you're playing it. And as you do that, every time you do, the next time is going to be easier and easier. So what it really comes down to is the consistency matters far more than how much time you're putting in. Now, one other thing about pros, great musicians, is that they are lifelong learners. Now, you may have heard about Pablo Casals, the great cellist. He was once asked when he was somewhere around 70. Actually, every time I hear the story, he gets older, but it was somewhere in his late 60s, early 70s. And he was asked in an interview why he practiced so much. And really what it comes down, he said, well, I think I'm beginning to make a little progress. He was already the best in the world. So, I mean, this is, kind of funny. And he was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But it is the way great musicians think. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a musician, because I knew it was a never-ending journey. I was fortunate enough to be in teach guitar in the early 80s at Johnny Smith's music store. Johnny, the great jazz guitar player from the 1950s and 60s. Johnny was there every day, and he had a guitar in his hand almost all the time. But one day I came in, and he said to me, I really hate to practice. He was getting ready for a gig, and I looked at him, and I said, wait a second, you've got a guitar in your hand all the time. What do you mean? Oh, that's not practicing. That's learning something new. And that's very much his attitude. Another time I came in, and he was looking at a big score of Albéniz's Iberia, classical work. And he points at one note, and he says to me, why did Segovia not play this note? It's right here. So he was always learning something new. And it's a great attitude. I also just watched this documentary about Wayne Shorter called Zero Gravity. If you haven't seen it, you really want to. It's brilliant. But it takes us through his entire life. And this man was learning right up until the day he died, and was creating new ideas and developing new music. And, if you know Wayne Shorter's music, I mean, I think most of us still struggle trying to play the music from the 1960s. Well, that was 60 years ago. He was way beyond that. So I highly encourage you to, if you haven't watched that video, to watch it. So, it's important that we continue to grow as a musician, but not just that, but we should also grow as a human being. And if we don't grow as a human being, it's actually pretty hard to grow as a musician, because we have to have something to say. And in the long run, this being a lifelong learner keeps us vital, keeps us active, keeps us young. So those are 3 pretty important habits that pretty much all of the fine musicians that I've known over my lifetime have followed. It's something that you should start looking into too. Why don't you leave me a comment down below, tell me what you think, and tell me what you're going to do to start to develop those habits for yourself. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video.